From prophecy to power, the rise of Septimius Severus. It began, as many great tales do, with a prophecy and a boy at the edge of the sea. In 145 CE, young Septimius Severus stood on the shores of Leptis Magna, his dark eyes fixed on the distant horizon where Africa's coastline melted into the vast Mediterranean. Born to the purple-hemmed togas of provincial nobility, he carried in his veins the mixed blood of Punic merchants and Roman settlers. Yet none who saw him that day could have guessed that this African boy would one day hold the fate of Rome in his hands, becoming her first emperor from the Dark Continent. The astrologers had whispered it in the marble-columned halls of his family's villa. "You shall be emperor when you have killed a living thing." The words would haunt him through decades of military campaigns, political intrigue, and civil wars as he rose from a provincial administrator to military commander, from an outsider to the master of the known world. This is the story of how a boy from the edges of empire became its heart, transforming not just his own destiny, but the very nature of what it meant to be Roman. In an age when emperors lasted months rather than years, Septimius Severus would forge a dynasty that would transform an empire and leave a legacy that would echo through centuries. Son of Africa. The streets of Leptis Magna pulsed with life in the summer of 145 CE. Merchant ships crowded the harbor, their holds stuffed with Spanish olive oil, Egyptian grain, and Syrian silk. Through the bustling forum, where Punic and Latin mingled freely in the air, walked the family of Publius Septimius Geta, their togas marking them as members of the equestrian order, Rome's second tier of nobility. Among them strode young Lucius Septimius Severus, already showing the sharp intelligence that would one day make him master of the Mediterranean world. The boy's education began in earnest that year, but not just in the traditional rhetoric and philosophy of Rome. In the markets and ports of Leptis Magna, he absorbed lessons no Roman school could teach: how Egyptian traders haggled in Greek, how Syrian merchants sealed deals with a handshake, how Numidian cavalry officers carried themselves with the pride of desert kings. His grandfather, Septimius Severus, after whom he was named, had served as a Punic suffect, a pre-Roman magistrate before the family adopted Roman ways. This heritage set young Severus apart, marking him as both insider and outsider, Roman and African, a duality that would shape his destiny. At 14, Severus experienced his first taste of power during the visit of proconsul Septimius Severus, no relation despite the shared name. The teenager watched, transfixed, as the governor dispensed justice from his ivory chair, commanded troops with a word, and moved through the world with the authority of Rome itself. That night, Severus announced to his family his intention to pursue a political career. His father, managing a smile that masked concern, reminded him that no African had ever risen higher than provincial governor. Young Severus's response was characteristic of the man he would become. "Then I shall be the first." His mastery of Latin and Greek grew alongside his ambition. The libraries of Leptis Magna, second only to Carthage in all of Africa, became his sanctuary. There, among scrolls of Tacitus and Suetonius, he devoured stories of emperors past, Augustus's cunning, Vespasian's pragmatism, Trajan's military genius. But it was the tale of Hannibal that captured his imagination most, another African who had almost conquered Rome itself. The irony would not be lost on future historians. In 162 CE, at 17, Severus prepared for his first journey to Rome. The night before his departure, a dream visited him, one he would recount to court historians years later. He saw himself standing atop the Palatine Hill, surveying all of Rome spread before him, the 7 hills gleaming with marble temples and golden roofs. As he awoke, the dream clung to him like the morning mist over Leptis Magna's harbor. Packing away his most prized possession, a small bronze statue of Tanit, the Punic goddess of his ancestors, Severus boarded the ship that would carry him toward his destiny. The provincial boy who would one day rule an empire took his first step onto the world stage, leaving behind the African shores that had shaped him, but never forgetting the lessons they had taught. Rise through chaos. Rome in 170 CE seethed with opportunity for those bold enough to grasp it. As military tribune in Syria, Septimius Severus found himself at the crossroads of empire, where ambitious men made their fortunes and failures vanished into obscurity. The Syrian posting might have seemed a backwater to some, but Severus recognized it for what it was: a crucible where military might met Eastern wealth, and where the real power of Rome often lay. The death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE sent tremors through the empire that would eventually crack its foundations. Severus watched from his position in Syria as Commodus, the emperor's son, transformed from philosopher prince to megalomaniac. While Rome's new master renamed months after himself and fought gladiators in the arena, Severus methodically built his power base. He cultivated relationships with Eastern merchants who controlled the silk trade, won the loyalty of veteran legionaries, and, most crucially, caught the eye of Julia Domna. The marriage to Julia Domna in 187 CE proved more than a mere political alliance. Daughter of the high priest of Amasa's sun god, she brought to their union a sharp political mind and connections throughout the eastern provinces. The Syrian priestess and the African commander made a formidable pair, their shared ambition matched only by their intellectual compatibility. Julia's interest in philosophy and Eastern mysticism complemented Severus's pragmatic military mind, creating a partnership that would reshape the empire. Then came 193 CE, the year that would shake Rome to its foundations. Emperor Pertinax, who had succeeded the assassinated Commodus, lasted only 87 days before the Praetorian Guard murdered him and infamously auctioned the empire to the highest bidder. The winner, Didius Julianus, celebrated his purchase of the purple by hosting lavish games in Rome. But even as he celebrated, 3 frontier commanders refused to accept an emperor who had bought his throne: Pescennius Niger in Syria, Clodius Albinus in Britain, and Severus in Pannonia. Severus moved first. While his rivals hesitated, he addressed his legions in Carnuntum. Standing before the assembled troops, the African commander reminded them of their poverty under Commodus, their shame under Julianus, and the riches that awaited in Rome. The soldiers' response echoed across the Danube Valley. They proclaimed him emperor on the spot. Within days, the Pannonian legions began their march on Rome, their standards gleaming in the spring sun, their boots drumming out a rhythm that would soon become the heartbeat of empire. As his army approached the Eternal City, Severus demonstrated the political cunning that would mark his reign. He sent messages to the Praetorian Guard, promising pardons in exchange for the surrender of Pertinax's murderers. Then, in a masterstroke, he declared himself the Avenger of Pertinax, adopting the dead emperor's name and promising to restore dignity to the purple. The Senate, reading the winds of power, declared Julianus a public enemy. When Severus's advance guard reached Rome, they found the would-be emperor's head already separated from his shoulders, a gift from a Senate eager to curry favor with the coming storm. But securing Rome was only the beginning. To the east, Pescennius Niger gathered his forces in Syria. To the north, Clodius Albinus watched and waited in Britain. The year of the 5 emperors had begun, and Septimius Severus, the African outsider who had dreamed of power on the shores of Leptis Magna, now stood at its center, ready to wage the civil wars that would determine the fate of an empire. The path to purple. The spring of 193 CE found Rome's newest emperor sleeping in full armor. Septimius Severus knew the price of complacency. The streets still whispered of Pertinax's fate. As he consolidated his position in the capital, reports arrived daily of Pescennius Niger's movements in the east. The Syrian governor had proclaimed himself emperor at Antioch, and the wealthy eastern provinces rallied to his banner. Meanwhile, Severus played a dangerous game with Clodius Albinus in Britain, offering him the title of Caesar, effectively naming him heir, while secretly preparing for the inevitable confrontation to come. The campaign against Niger opened with a lightning strike at Byzantium. The city's legendary walls, which had repelled Philip of Macedon centuries before, now faced the full might of Severus's Pannonian legions. But Byzantium would not fall easily. Its defenders used bronze chains to snare Severan ships, ingenious flame-throwing devices to ward off attackers, and even catapulted live bears into the ranks of besieging troops. The siege would drag on for 3 years, becoming one of the most brutal in Roman history. While Byzantium held firm, Severus led his main force into Asia Minor. At Cyzicus, near the Hellespont, the armies of Africa and Syria clashed in the winter rain. Niger's eastern troops, accustomed to lighter skirmishing with Parthian horsemen, broke against the disciplined shield walls of Severus's Danube legions. The battle turned into a rout, with Niger's forces fleeing south through the Taurus Mountains. At Issus, where Alexander the Great had defeated Darius 3 centuries earlier, the armies met again. History repeated itself as Niger's eastern forces crumbled. The would-be emperor fled to Antioch, but was captured and beheaded. His head, preserved in honey, made the long journey to Byzantium, where Severus ordered it displayed before the walls, a gruesome message to the besieged defenders. Yet even as Byzantium finally fell, news arrived from the west that Clodius Albinus had dropped all pretense of loyalty. The governor of Britain had crossed the Channel with his legions, gathering support throughout Gaul. Severus, showing the strategic brilliance that marked his career, left enough forces to secure the east and raced westward with his veteran units. The final confrontation came at Lugdunum in 197 CE, the largest battle between Roman armies ever fought on Gallic soil. On a cold February morning, 150,000 Romans faced their countrymen across the plains near modern Lyon. Albinus's British legions initially broke Severus's left wing, and for a moment, victory seemed within the British governor's grasp. Severus himself plunged into the fighting, rallying his troops by example. The tide turned when his cavalry commander, Leptis, appeared with fresh horsemen at the critical moment. Albinus's army collapsed, and the pretender took his own life in a nearby villa. Severus ordered the corpse decapitated, sending the head to Rome as a warning to the Senate, while leaving the body to rot on the palace doorstep, a final insult to his former Caesar. The victory at Lugdunum marked the end of civil war and the true beginning of Severus's reign. The African outsider had defeated all challengers, avenged Pertinax, and secured his position through force of arms. But the cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of Rome's finest soldiers dead, eastern provinces ravaged, and the loyalty of the British legions suspect. As Severus rode back to Rome in triumph, he must have remembered the prophecy from his youth: "You shall be emperor when you have killed a living thing." He had killed many things indeed to wear the purple, but the greatest challenges of his reign still lay ahead. Master of war, the Parthian campaigns of Septimius Severus. The Parthian campaigns began as a matter of honor, but ended as a demonstration of Roman might that would have made Trajan himself envious. In 197 CE, while Severus dealt with Albinus in Gaul, the Parthian king Vologases V had opportunistically invaded Roman Mesopotamia, believing the empire too fractured to respond. He would soon learn the cost of underestimating Rome's African emperor. By autumn of 197 CE, Severus had gathered an invasion force that would dwarf all previous eastern expeditions. At its heart stood the veteran legions that had won him the throne, now hardened by years of civil war. The emperor's teenage son Caracalla marched alongside him, learning the art of war from a master strategist. Julia Domna, breaking with tradition, accompanied the army her presence a clear signal that this campaign would reshape the East. The invasion began with characteristic Severan efficiency. Rather than follow the traditional invasion route through Armenia, Severus struck directly across the Euphrates, catching the Parthians off guard. The great city of Nisibis fell quickly, becoming a forward base for the Roman advance. Severus had studied the failures of previous emperors carefully. He knew that in the east, logistics determined victory. His army advanced like a massive machine, building roads and fortifications as it moved, establishing supply lines that would sustain a long campaign. The culmination came at Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital, in 198 CE. The city had repelled Roman armies before, but Severus brought something new: a siege train that included massive artillery pieces transported in sections down the Euphrates. For days, Roman batteries hammered the city's defenses while sappers undermined its walls. When the assault finally came, it was swift and brutal. The Roman army poured through the breaches, and the city that had defied emperors for centuries fell to the son of Africa. Severus's treatment of Ctesiphon sent shockwaves through the eastern world. Unlike previous Roman commanders who had merely raided the city, he intended to erase Parthian power permanently. His troops systematically looted the palace treasury, enslaved thousands, and destroyed the administrative heart of the Parthian Empire. The message was clear: Rome under Severus would not simply defeat its enemies, it would break them. The campaign's aftermath revealed Severus's greater vision. New provinces were organized, client kingdoms established, and trade routes secured. The emperor who had once watched Eastern merchants in Leptis Magna now controlled their destinies. He established the Mesopotamian frontier as a military zone backed by civilian settlements, creating an empire within an empire that would serve as a bulwark against Eastern threats for generations. But perhaps the most significant outcome was psychological. Severus had accomplished what even the great Trajan could not. He had broken Parthian power so thoroughly that it would never fully recover. The Parthian Empire, weakened by his campaigns, would soon fall to the rising Sassanid Persians. Yet even this worked to Rome's advantage, as the political chaos in the east gave the empire decades to strengthen its new frontier. As Severus stood atop the ziggurat of Ctesiphon, surveying the empire he had expanded, he must have reflected on how far he had come from the shores of Africa. He had now surpassed every emperor since Trajan in military glory, and his African origins only made the victory sweeter. The man whom some senators still dismissed as a provincial had extended Roman power farther east than any emperor before him. But even this triumph would not satisfy him. For in the west, another frontier called, and with it, the chance to secure his legacy forever. The price of power. By 208 CE, as Severus prepared for his final campaign, the strands of triumph and tragedy in his life had become inextricably intertwined. His sons, Caracalla and Geta, had grown into young men who despised each other with an intensity that alarmed even the battle-hardened generals of Rome. Julia Domna watched helplessly as her children's rivalry threatened to tear apart everything she and her husband had built. The emperor himself, now in his 60s, suffered from gout that left him limping. Yet when word arrived of trouble in Britain, he did not hesitate to mount one final expedition. The British campaign revealed both the strength and weakness of Severus's empire. The army that crossed Hadrian's Wall in 209 CE was the most powerful force ever assembled on British soil, not just legionaries, but Moorish cavalry, Syrian archers, and Germanic auxiliaries, a testament to how Severus had transformed Rome's military. Yet within this mighty host, the seeds of destruction festered. Caracalla, now co-emperor, openly plotted against his younger brother Geta, whom Severus had also elevated to imperial rank in a futile attempt to force cooperation between his sons. The campaign itself took on a mythic quality that would be remembered in British folklore for centuries. The Caledonian tribes, led by fierce warriors painted blue with woad, employed guerrilla tactics that frustrated the Romans. They melted away into misty forests before Roman forces could engage them, only to emerge later to attack supply lines and isolated units. Severus responded with characteristic thoroughness, ordering his troops to systematically destroy the tribal infrastructure, burning farms, destroying boats, and slaughtering livestock. It was during this campaign that Caracalla made his first attempt to seize power. Classical sources record that while riding with his father, Caracalla drew his sword, intending to strike Severus from behind. The plot was foiled only because the accompanying guards shouted a warning. Severus, in a moment that captured the tragedy of his final years, did not even turn around. He simply continued riding in silence, the weight of his son's betrayal hanging heavier than his imperial purple. The harsh British winter of 210 CE proved a more formidable enemy than the Caledonians. Severus's gout worsened in the damp climate, often leaving him unable to walk. Yet he drove himself and his army relentlessly forward, determined to secure one last frontier for Rome. In a bitter irony, the man who had conquered Parthia found himself stymied by tribal warriors in the empire's most distant province. When he finally called a halt to the campaign, it was not defeat that stopped him, but the deterioration of his own body. In February of 211 CE, in the fortress of Eboracum, modern York, Severus faced his final hours. His last words to his quarreling sons became famous: "Work hard, stay united, pay the soldiers, and ignore everyone else." It was both a summary of his life's philosophy and a desperate plea to preserve his legacy. Julia Domna, who had shared his rise from provincial obscurity to imperial power, sat with him until the end. The African boy who had stared at the Mediterranean waves, dreaming of empire, died far from home on Britain's northern frontier. The aftermath proved as dramatic as Severus's life. His sons, ignoring his deathbed counsel, accelerated their feud. Within a year, Caracalla would lure Geta into a supposed reconciliation meeting, only to have him murdered in their mother's arms. Julia Domna, forced to smile and publicly support her son, even as she mourned her murdered child, embodied the cruel bargain of imperial power. The Severan dynasty would continue, but the unity their founder had dreamed of died in Eboracum with him. Yet Severus's impact on Rome transcended his family's tragedies. The empire he left behind was more multicultural, more militarized, and more centralized than ever before. He had transformed the very nature of Roman power, shifting its center of gravity away from Italy and toward the provinces. The African emperor had changed what it meant to be Roman, creating a template for empire that would endure long after his dynasty's fall. Legacy of the African Augustus. Time would prove Septimius Severus more revolutionary than even his contemporaries realized. His reign marked not just the end of one era, but the birth of another, a transformation so profound that historians would later mark it as the death of the classical Roman Empire and the birth of late antiquity. The world he created would endure long after the last member of his dynasty fell to an assassin's blade. In Rome itself, his architectural legacy rose in stone and concrete. The massive Septizodium, a cascading fountain complex that dominated the Palatine Hill's southern face, announced to all who approached from the Via Appia that a new dynasty had remade the capital. His restoration of the Pantheon, the Temple of Peace, and countless other monuments changed Rome's skyline. But his most lasting monument stood in the Forum, the Arch of Severus, which still towers over the ancient heart of Rome today, its reliefs telling the story of Eastern victories in a style that would influence Roman art for centuries. Yet Severus's most profound impact lay not in stone, but but in the very fabric of Roman society. The man who had once been mocked for his African accent transformed the empire's social structure. Under his reign, Eastern and African families entered the Senate in unprecedented numbers. The traditional Italian aristocracy found themselves sharing power with Syrian merchants, African landowners, and Gallic chieftains. His famous declaration, "Pay the soldiers and ignore everyone else," heralded a new reality where military might, not senatorial approval, determined imperial power. In his beloved Leptis Magna, Severus built a new Rome in Africa. The city he transformed with a massive building program rivaled the capital itself, with a forum, basilica, and harbour complex that stand among the most impressive Roman ruins in existence. This was no mere vanity project. It was a statement that Rome's future lay as much in the provinces as in Italy itself. The Severan women, led by Julia Domna, created a new model of imperial power. Long after her husband's death, Julia continued as the power behind the throne, gathering philosophers and legal scholars at her court, shaping policy, and maintaining the empire's stability. Her sister Julia Maesa, and later her nieces Julia Soemius and Julia Mamaea, would dominate Roman politics for decades, installing and removing emperors with a skill that would have made Augustus himself envious. Perhaps Severus's most lasting legacy was the transformation of Roman military culture. His decision to allow soldiers to marry while in service, increase their pay substantially, and station them permanently in frontier provinces created a hereditary military class that would define late Roman society. The army he reformed would protect the empire for another 2 centuries, even as the political structure he created gradually crumbled. In the end, Severus achieved something rare in history. He fundamentally changed the nature of one of the world's greatest empires, not through revolution, but through evolution. The provincial outsider who dreamed of power on African shores had not just conquered Rome, he had reinvented it. His reign marked the last time the empire would be truly united and prosperous, a golden age before the crisis of the 3rd century would tear the Roman world apart. As the sun sets over the ruins of Leptis Magna today, visitors can still trace the outline of Severus's magnificent buildings rising from the desert sand. The African emperor who became a slave to ambition, then master of the known world, left us more than just monuments. He left us the story of how an outsider from the empire's edges grasped the very heart of Roman power, and in doing so, changed the definition of what it meant to be Roman forever.